Welcome to the Young Professionals Learning Community. Today we're going to be talking about youth data literacy and data justice. My name is Joshua Calorino. I work at Youth Move National. I'm one of the youth program specialists there. I'm kind of the familiar face, but as you see, that photo isn't Christian, very different. So I'm actually going to go ahead and invite my co-facilitator today to introduce themselves.
Hi, everyone. My name is TJ McGrath. I'm also part of the Youth Move National team, but I work closely with member services.
I will turn it over to today's facilitator. Please take it away.
My name is Eden Shavi, Youth Data Literacy and Data Justice, targeted specifically toward youth organizations and youth peer professionals, which is great because I myself am a young peer professional and I love getting to chat with others about data justice and why it's so crucial to be versed in its constantly evolving landscape as pertains to youth in particular. I have given different versions of this talk before in different contexts. I had developed an interactive workshop for the Youth Move Change Initiative back in November, and also spoke to some of these ideas at a Youth Move National Research and Evaluation Subcommittee meeting. So if anyone has engaged with me in any of those spaces, some of these slides are going to look pretty familiar to you. There is some overlap. But others speak to completely new ideas and are entirely different. So I'm excited to share that with you. So just a little bit about me. I am a young adult with lived experience in state and service systems. I am a certified peer specialist in the state of Massachusetts. I have been a member of the Youth Best Practice Committee and the Research and Evaluation Subcommittee at Youth Move National for about 3 years now. I am a grad student at Tufts, where I study methods in data analysis and health information science. And prior to committing to full-time grad work, I had supported the ongoing evaluation of 4 young adult access centers across Massachusetts, where I had been a youth served at one of those sites just a couple of years prior. I became really interested in data activism and data justice work as a young adult receiving services because I was very frustrated about not knowing anything about where the data and information being collected about me and my friends was going and why. And that curiosity of where does information go and why became really central to how I engaged in just about every space in my work, in my personal life, and then eventually in my studies. So I am thrilled to be able to talk with you all about it today. Before we dive into anything, it is really important to acknowledge the question of why does this matter? Why am I here? How is this relevant to my work as a young person or with young people? And the reason is that our work and our lives are increasingly mediated by data. Whether you're working in a role that necessitates some level of documentation about others, or you're receiving services in which documentation about you is being recorded, or simply existing as a person with a cell phone in the world, right? In which every interaction that you have with that device is constantly generating data that goes somewhere. We are all facilitators, recipients, and contributors to a much larger data ecosystem in which the data contained within are powerful. We will talk about why data are so powerful a bit later on in the presentation, but a few key applications include that data affect funding streams. Their presence, their absence, their accuracy, their inaccuracy can be the difference between having really vital youth programming funded or not funded. Data can inform policy. They can be the difference between adequately informed decision-making by policymakers and really not great decisions that impact young people and their support systems. And perhaps most salient and most relevant to data justice, data can change the way that people, in this case, young people, are perceived and treated by entities which hold power over them. And so any initiative that requires the collection, the use, or the analysis of data about young people and their lives really ought to be informed by these underlying principles of data justice, data ethics, and data literacy amongst the people to whom these data pertain. In other words, if data about you or your community are being collected, used, or analyzed for any purpose, these principles dictate that you should be able to know critique and assert fairness in the way that you or your community is being made visible through data and the consequences of how you're being made visible. Oftentimes by people who have no connection to you or to your community, but are relying on decontextualized numbers to make decisions that affect you very directly. And so a key way to involve more people in the pursuit of data justice and data ethics, especially those involved in vital youth programming and advocacy, is to promote data literacy, where the understanding of how data are used in an increasingly data-driven and data-mediated world, where data and power are so intricately interconnected. And that is what this presentation aims to do. We will first talk about what data are, how they're collected, how they're structured, and why they become so darn important in our lives. Then we'll talk about the relationship between data and power, which underscores the tenets of data justice. We'll talk about data justice in the context of young adult communities and why this is so important and relevant to our work. And then finally, we're going to end with some actionable steps for young people and youth serving organizations to incorporate data justice more meaningfully into their work, and some resources that you may find beneficial. On that note, I do want to give the caveat that this presentation will not be all-encompassing. Because nothing this complex or dynamic can ever be fully shared in such a short time frame. And I am certainly not an authority on all things in this realm, but my hope is that our time together will provide you not only an introduction to some really cool concepts, but more importantly, that it will act as an invitation for you to explore the topics that interest you within this presentation further on your own, and think about how they can be applied to your own work, your own life, and your advocacy. So without further ado, we'll start with the basics of what the heck are data anyway? What are these things, right? So data are typically defined as pieces of information like measurements and outputs that are used to calculate, analyze, or plan something. But here's the thing. Data can kind of be anything, right? From the number of mugs you have, to your blood pressure reading at any given time, to your favorite color, to the contents of a text you sent to your best friend this morning. Data are just pockets of information stored in different ways. People will sometimes make the distinction that information is just data in context. And so because data can kind of be anything, humans over time have come up with lots of different and interesting systems for classifying them. And these categorizations are broadly called data types. And it's important for you to know about them because the type of data you have informs what you and what others can do with them. So I'd like to walk you through a few different data types that you may already be familiar with, but are relevant and important to know about if you don't. The first are quantitative and qualitative data. Quantitative data, as the name suggests, are quantifiable. These are numeric values. They answer questions like how many, how much, how often, whereas qualitative data cannot be quantified. They answer questions like what happened, how are you feeling, or what's your favorite color? These data are often described as providing a richness to a narrative where quantitative data are not always able to in the same way. Then we have structured and unstructured data. Structured data are highly organized in a tabular fashion. These are the data that you will find in spreadsheets and relational databases. And for a really long time, these were the only kinds of data that we could computationally analyze until advancements in computing power brought us the ability to analyze unstructured data, which are data whose native formats are not tabular. These are free text and images and PDFs and your social media activity and all the things that you may not have known that people are able to track and analyze, but do. Just to give you a visual, this is an example of structured data. The columns or variables correspond to cases or rows. If I want to know what the age of the person in record number 3 is, all I have to do is locate the correct case 3 rows down and slide over 1 to retrieve the answer of 24 years. These data are very easy to read and analyze and have been since about the 1960s when the relational database was first introduced. Within these structured data sets, you can have both quantitative and qualitative data. Age, for example, is a quantitative measure. It is a meaningful number that we can calculate statistics on, right? And there is a meaningful standardized numeric difference between an age of 16 years and an age of 24 years. On the other hand, favorite color is not a numeric variable, but a qualitative one, right? A favorite color of blue doesn't have any meaningful numeric difference from a favorite color of yellow, for example. But both of these pieces of information can be stored in the same database. While structured data are really easy to analyze and are what most people are generally familiar with, the majority of the data in the data ecosystem are actually unstructured. And as mentioned, up until recently, we didn't have the computing power to process or analyze these kinds of data at scale. And these newfound capabilities have resulted in this incredible boom of what's called big data, or the absolutely massive accumulation of data collected and analyzed every single second of the day. These are the kinds of data that are often most relevant to conversations around data justice, because a lot of these data are collected passively or implicitly, i.e., without people's explicit knowledge, including young people. So what does that mean, right? Essentially, active data collection is the process by which we are actively providing data, right? These are data that are actively provided by a person. They are surveys and questionnaires and person-reported outcomes, the things that we typically associate with the need for an informed consent or an IRB approval for those who are familiar with research or evaluation protocols. But increasingly, the use of passive data collection is becoming ubiquitous to being a part of our society. Everything we do generates data, from searching the internet to walking past a security camera to purchasing something with a credit card to using GPS to clicking on an advertisement to looking at an advertisement. These data are becoming increasingly connected to one another such that they can be used to make predictions and inferences about you and other people that various prediction models and algorithms have determined to be like you in any number of ways. More than 2.5 billion gigabytes of data are generated every single day. And something that I'd like for you to think about throughout this presentation and beyond is how you feel about how much data is being collected about you and just about everyone around you all the time. It's kind of weird to think about, right? And so it yields a lot of really interesting and ethically complicated questions. And speaking of ethics, for some of the very reasons that we've alluded to thus far, there have been justifications for many, many years for data usage ethics frameworks. And some of the most famous foundations of data ethics principles and practices actually come from the field of medicine and biology, which I have affectionately termed the OGs of data ethics. Seminal texts like the Declaration of Helsinki and the Belmont Report, which really dealt with the ethics surrounding human experimentation and research, also informed the foundations of ethical human-related data practices. Also incredibly influential in the healthcare arena was the introduction of the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, or HIPAA, which among other things is really well known for its privacy rules concerning protected health information. But there was a problem. Most of these influential guidelines were highly specific to their respective fields and practices. If we revisit the HIPAA example for a moment, because HIPAA only applies to covered healthcare entities, which are very specifically defined, the protection of these data is contingent on who is in possession of the data at any given moment, rather than on the characteristics of the data alone. And it just wasn't anticipated at the time of these watershed regulatory developments that there would be such a huge explosion of big data, making this far more ethically complicated. A good question that typically follows the question of, just how much data gets collected about everyone and everything is the question of why. Why are all these data collected? What is the reason? What's driving this? And while this can vary by field and by intent, the answer at large in the commercial space really lies in industrialization. Industrial revolutions are characterized by a transition of some kind of human process to a machine. While the first and second industrial revolutions marked a transition from physical human processes to machines with the introduction of steam and water power and electricity, the third and fourth industrial revolutions, which is what we are presently in, has marked the transition of mental and intellectual human processes to machines with the introduction of personal computers, increased automation, mobile devices, cyber physical systems, and yes, quote, artificial intelligence. Now, these mechanisms only work when a massive amount of data are available to train, test, and pilot them appropriately. Therefore, data have become an incredible commodity, meaning that a propensity toward more data tends to indicate the potential for more money. Given the tie between money and power, it really didn't take too long for the people already structurally and systemically affected by that relationship to recognize that data and power were also intricately connected. So while already really well known in marginalized scholar and activist communities, the fourth industrial revolution has also represented a period of mainstream recognition of the relationship between data and power in societal contexts, as seen in a number of very popular documentaries and books that have examined this relationship in one way or another, including the very popular Social Dilemma, Coded Bias, Weapons of Math Destruction, Algorithms of Oppression, and Targeted, just to name a few. To understand this monumental shift in awareness and its importance to data justice, we need to take a look back at the history of data collection itself. So humans have been collecting and tracking information for thousands of years. This is not new, with some of our earliest examples being the use of notches on sticks to mark the passing of days and early public record keeping in Mesopotamia and in Egypt around 3000 BCE. But while the word information in its current context dates back to the 14th century in French from Latin, the word data in its present context didn't appear in the English language until the mid-17th century. And that sudden emergence was kind of weird. And the reason it was kind of weird was because we already had words to describe this kind of information. We had words like observation and measurement and evidence. And that begs the really valid question of why did we need another word? And why did it become so widely used and widely popularized in such a short period of time? Well, it is speculated that this served a very specific purpose, because referring to information as data, as opposed to any other existing word to describe the information, served to substantiate claims that may have otherwise been debatable. But as so eloquently stated by Catherine D'Ignazio and Lauren Klein, what information needs to become data before it can be trusted? Or more precisely, whose? This is the piercing question that underscores the roots of data activism. So data activism is characterized by ground-up community data collection that is often a response to missing or biased data from which decisions affecting that community are made. Referring back to the excellent work of D'Ignazio and Klein, they state that the inequitable representation in and of data sets is common in societies characterized by unequal power relations in which a gendered, racialized order is maintained through willful disregard, deferral of responsibility, and organized neglect for data and statistics about those minoritized bodies who do not hold power. In other words, given the relationship between data and power, data can be used to further marginalize people, either through the willful underrepresentation in data sets that govern vital decisions, or overrepresentation in data sets that inform surveillance. These things are simultaneously true and disproportionately affect marginalized communities where quantification is representation until it's not. A very famous example of data activism includes the work of celebrated investigative journalist I.W. Wells, who gathered and published an encompassing data set in the late 19th century detailing acts of violence against Black people, accompanied by a scathing investigation of fraudulent claims made by white people who tried to justify this violence. This is one of the most notable documented occurrences of using data to challenge power structures. A second example is the work of the Airbeat youth activists in Roxbury, Massachusetts in the late 90s, who were among the first to investigate the potential links between high asthma rates and air pollution. After realizing that a suspiciously high number of them experienced symptoms of asthma, these young people suspected that air quality in Roxbury might be the culprit. And so they not only led a march that caught governmental and media attention, but they also co-developed a community-led real-time air pollution monitoring system known as Airbeat. And their groundbreaking data activism has been the foundation for a huge body of work in the environmental justice space for over 20 years, which is incredibly cool. But while data activism is incredibly cool, and it is awesome, it is really important to not lose sight of the fact that the need for this kind of activism is grounded in the frankly very uncomfortable recognition that across history and context, it has not been until a marginalized community's experience was quantified in a specific way that it received adequate attention. So while there is undeniable value in the use of measurement and evidence as a basis for decision-making, we must also grapple with this really uncomfortable truth that a simultaneous underpinning of any data-driven initiative is a historically rooted institutional mistrust of lived experience and experiential wisdom. And I have come to understand this to be an incredibly salient point of tension in lived experience community work like peer support by virtue of the work that we do, because there is often a misalignment of metrics and documentation rooted in this historical mistrust, and it now has things like competitive funding attached to it. And that's one of the many reasons why data justice work at this particular intersection is so important. Something I like to note at this point after touching on data activism is this fallacy of neutral data. There is this incredible misconception in data-driven spaces that data are inherently unbiased or objective. You will hear all the time about how numbers don't lie and the truth is in the data, but I am here to inform you that data do not exist independently from the means by which they are collected and measured. Data do not simply exist. They have to be recorded to exist. And so before there are data, there are decisions about the how and the why and the when and the who. And these decisions made by people or by machines made by people are the result of historically inequitable collection, interpretation, and feedback structures. There is always a valid reason to be curious about any data source, first in terms of representation relative to a population, and second in terms of its collection infrastructure. Who collected these data? Why did they collect them? Are the interests of the communities represented in the data set also represented in the team which called for or designed for their collection? Are there mediating factors that were not taken into consideration? And a lot of other fun questions that often tend to go unanswered. So now that we have a grasp on what data are, how they can be collected, the relationship between data and power, the roots of data activism, and debunking the myth that data are inherently neutral or objective, let's turn our attention to data justice in youth communities. To give a more polished definition of data justice itself, we can think of it as fairness in the way that people are made visible, represented, and treated as a result of their production of data. So in application to youth, data justice is fairness in the way that young people are made visible, represented, and treated as the result of their production of data. In terms of how this applies to young adult communities, we really have to think back to what we know about data and power structures, recognizing that youth and young adults comprise their own unique social class, commonly characterized by both a desire for autonomy, but limitation in the ability to exercise autonomy legally, socially, and structurally. The characterization of young people in data sets is the combination of both overrepresentation as a data supplier, but underrepresentation in the governance or decisions related to the protections of these data. My assumption is that we all spend or have spent a lot of time working within the youth mental health space. So something that you probably know is that over the last 10 years or so, there has been an explosion of, quote, mental health crisis prediction and intervention solutions based primarily on social media data sources and something called digital phenotypes. If you haven't yet heard of digital phenotyping, this is defined as a real-time quantification of individual level human phenotypes resulting from data from personal devices like smartphones. And it's been proposed in the literature as a cutting-edge methodology to aid in things like psychiatric diagnosis. Examples of digital phenotypes include typing speed and the amount of time your phone spends in darkness, or the hashtags that you tend to use on which days at which time. And there are proposed prediction models in the literature for which typing speed, for example, is used as a predictor for certain diagnoses in combination with other things. And if that doesn't somewhat alarm you to an extent, maybe it should. Young people make up the largest user populations of the most popular social media platforms and tend to be the most engaged with their mobile devices on a daily basis when compared to other age groups, meaning that there is good reason to believe that they are overrepresented in these data sources. And as such, perhaps by virtue of the data that are publicly available for scraping, a lot of these interventions do seem to be focused on youth and young adults. Once again, as with other marginalized communities, young adults are overrepresented in these surveillance-based data sets, but the data which contextualize the nuances and the complexities of their lives, which would make prediction models far less straightforward, hardly exist to the same extent. And like many of us know, those unmeasured or mismeasured nuances and modifying contexts are really quite important. If this wasn't enough to get your attention, another pressing issue relative to the relationship between youth autonomy and data is that for the first time, we are about to be faced with the first members of an eventual generation whose digital footprints pre-existed their birth. And what I mean by that, in all seriousness, is that an extensive body of literature is investigating the ethical quandaries around people being profiled by companies based on personal data generation before they're even born. If this is a bit hard to wrap your head around, I'd like to make this tangible with an example. Let's take, for instance, a pregnant person who is actively using 3 different commercial applications throughout and just before their pregnancy. An ovulation tracking app to identify their ideal conditions for pregnancy, a pregnancy tracking app to monitor their pregnancy once they are pregnant, and then a food tracking app to surveil their consumption while pregnant. By the time their child is born, an underregulated commercial digital info space already has proprietorship over data and information about the conditions of this young person's conception, the events of the pregnancy leading up to their birth, and the kinds of nourishment that they received in utero, all of which, as speculated by this body of literature, can be used as physiological indicators available for profiling eventual consumer and health-related characteristics based on statistical inference, not to mention any information shared on social media by or about them on social media platforms by their support systems that are also increasingly aggregated with these data using analysis methods for unstructured data sources. The reason I share these examples with you is not only to characterize the real things that are happening with young people and the data that they're generating, but also to emphasize that as our society and the systems which hold power over young people continue to place more and more weight on data without due regulation or youth involvement, youth advocacy can't really exist without data justice. And cool organizations that advocate alongside youth in any space are uniquely positioned to assert themselves into these conversations in meaningful ways that other organizations just can't. A really good example of this is the youth-led advocacy organization Encode Justice that looks at data justice from the lens of how non-collaborative or paternalistic artificial intelligence systems, biased machine learning algorithms, and automation at large can affect youth and other marginalized populations. They, like Youth Move, are a chapter-based organization with representation across several US states. There is a dire need for young people and youth organizations to be informed of and involved in data justice initiatives because data justice enables young people to formulate ideas about their data rights and to learn how to partake in data activism. So I'd like to share with you a few ideas for how you or your organization can start to dip your toes into this. First, of course, is to explore for yourself. There are books and papers and newsletters and social media accounts that are dedicated to informing as many people as possible about what's going on in the data justice space and how you can get involved. I am including a few of these resources on the following slides. Other things include learning about the information and data governance practices that are happening at your own organizations. These can come in a series of different questions like, what data are being collected about young people and why? What regulations inform what needs to be collected and for how long these data are kept? What decisions do these data inform, and are there things that are missing from the implied narrative? How are questions being asked? How are we accounting for bias? Are young people involved in the creation or the audit of these questions? What assumptions are being made in analyses? And is there a mechanism to receive and integrate feedback about what's collected and why? In terms of participation, I encourage you to find out if there are ways to get involved in community stakeholder audits of data collection or analysis plans, whether that be through attending an evaluation meeting for a program that you are directly involved in or advocating for youth to have a seat at that table. But I do want to speak to some nuance here that I feel is really, really important. And that is that lived experience advocacy around issues pertaining to data usage and youth adds layers of complexity that precede a seat at the table. And what I mean by that is that in the age-old ask that youth with lived experience be part of conversations and inform mental health or substance use support practice and policy, the only expertise that young people need to bring to the table is their own lived experience. The onus really only falls on an organization to open up its table to young people. But these issues around data usage at these tables with monolith tech companies and the policymakers that regulate them, there is also an onus on us and the young people that we support to understand the mechanics of a data ecosystem, which can be a huge access barrier. How can we reasonably expect youth to meaningfully participate in ways that make change without first providing them with the information that enables that participation in the first place, right? And so that's where data literacy education comes in, which is something that I advocate for within youth communities, particularly within intersectional youth communities in which young people may identify with one or more marginalized identity that can be misrepresented in data sets. And so on that theme, another way to get involved in this work is to outreach organizations like Encode Justice that seek the power of youth voice to make change in this space. And finally, you can develop and organize yourselves, whether that be through the creation and proposal of a data usage bill of rights, or the development of community workshops where you yourself can speak to these issues and inform others, kind of like what I'm doing right now. Here's the beginning of a list of resources that I compiled. I also put these together with a hyperlinked text document that I'm happy to provide to anyone who's interested. The first slide includes relevant organizations. The second details some relevant books, papers and chapters. And the third, details relevant documentaries. This is far from an encompassing list, but these are a few that I have found particularly insightful. I want to conclude by saying that we talked about a whole heck of a lot. There were a lot of things that were mentioned, but my hope is that if you found any of this interesting, that you'll consider investigating further on your own and thinking critically about how you can integrate meaningful youth data justice into your work, your advocacy, and your lives.